this was on the article you wrote in 1994, Welcome to the Auschwitz of the Mind, and just wanted to read some stuff and then follow up with a question for you, if that's all right.
Sure, go on.
You're talking about a colleague of yours, Alan. It says, Alan is a Christian, which means he earns money the on-kosher way. He works for it. Our religion and culture are based on workaholic toil to pay the taxes and bear the burdens, so yeshiva guys can sit around and masticate Talmud all day, holler, quote, persecution, and feed at one public trough or another. So you're comparing them to pigs. Either upon the backs of befuddled denizens of the Deutsche Banana Republic or the flag-waving Shriners here in the district of corruption. Before you shower your anti-Goyimite invectives upon me for making the distinction between Christian working people and Edomite parasites, and then you go on. So I'm curious how calling this group of people parasites and comparing them to pigs fits with some of what you said about dehumanization.
Good question, and thank you for having the courage to ask it. Obviously, most of the people here are supporters of mine, so it took courage for this guy to ask a question. I've had to be in your position myself on the opposite end, so I congratulate you on that. First of all, what I say is if the shoe fits, wear it. I didn't call Jews parasites, and you'll hardly ever hear me use the word Jew. First of all, because I don't believe that today's modern-day Khazars and Sephardim are actually the genetic descendants of Jacob Israel. But secondly, I said Edomites. The Edomites are parasites, and that's the descendants of Esau, spiritually now, not racially. And the God of the Old Testament has had a whole statement on that. The other thing about feeding at a pig's trough, well, that's common parlance in the United States to refer to politicians who are feeding at the trough. I use the common parlance. In 1994, I was involved in satire because I was very frustrated that the Auschwitz homicidal gas chamber hoax still continued to have legs. And I was upset at some of my fellow revisionists who felt that the only approach to the subject was through engineering studies and forensics and all of these dry technical reports that didn't really seem to have the impact. When I thought back over the history of ideas and how one idea has fallen into the dust and new ideas have arisen, I saw that it was typically the artist who was the architect of that process of change. And I thought that through satire and prose and literature it might be that way. But I don't regret saying it, and I stand behind those words, because if you see it in the context of a satire and the fact that I did not bash Jews, but rather Edomites.
It's still a group of people. I mean, Jesus called us to love our enemies, so how does that fit for you?
Oh, sure, yeah, love our enemies. As a German American, I've been on the receiving end, and many other people of German ethnicity, of a constant stream of defamation and hatred directing at us, and we're human too. So I have a thin skin sometimes too. I did in 1994. I think I've grown more in the Lord since then. But I do think that we have to understand that if you believe, as I believe, that the Auschwitz homicidal gas chamber is an imposture, that story, then it becomes a form of false witness. And so if you're on the receiving end of a lot of false witness from smug people, you can get angry, and satire historically for our people has been all the way back to St. Jerome, who called St. Ambrose that oracular crow and was known for some tough language. I used some tough language, and I at that time did not think that I had to have a special reverence for this master race. It's going to be a reaction from people, and I think satire is a legitimate genre for that reaction. Yes?
Well, Jesus himself didn't have very kind remarks. It's worse than I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, because, for example, he said that when they made a proselyte, the proselyte was twice the children of hell that they were. But I think what the gentleman is suggesting is that there is a level of polemic that is within the bounds of Christianity and what Christ expected of us, and then there's a polemic, however truthful, that steps outside those bounds. Am I correct that was one of your points? And I think that's a legitimate point. I would just disagree that particular form of satire was out of bounds. But that was a very heated internet debate, by the way. It's collected in a book called Hoffman Contra the Khazar. Anybody else?
I appreciate your talk today. That was great. I wish you could have actually a larger Jewish audience, and I don't know how often you have a very big one, but it'd be good for them to hear it, because they need to hear the other side of the coin. I think a lot of them, I know Jews that but, you know, that are deceived by their teachings and their kind of traditions that are pretty bizarre, like you explained. I was curious, have you ever done any research on John Paul II as far as his lineage? Because I did some research on that, I pretty much think his mom was Jewish.
I don't understand. What difference would it make? I mean, there seems to be this, I'm glad you asked the question because it lets me answer something that I think is an error in our movement, that we're looking for this concept of the Marano, see? And this feeds into the rabbis. It feeds into what they're teaching to the Judaics, because they're teaching that even if you convert to Christianity, you're never truly going to be accepted. And yes, there were, of course, false converts, people who pretended to be Christian. I think Malachi Martin is an example of that. He was descended from Judaic merchants who found refuge in Ireland, and he was one of the best double or triple agents that I've ever seen operating the cryptocracy in the 20th century. I don't think he was that way because he was Judaic. And I want to make it clear that we accept converts. They have to be sincere. And then once they're in, and we find that they're sincere, we will no longer look to an alleged racial root as a source of possible future perfidy. Because if we do that, we're playing into the hands of the rabbis. And I don't want to do that. So to me, it's immaterial, or virtually so, whether or not John Paul II was a Khazar. I would never call him a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but if he was from Khazaria, if indeed he was of the Khazars, he might have a predisposition, as Aaron Cardinal Lustiger does, the Cardinal Primate of France.
He was a convert.
Yeah, he's a convert, and he's a bad one. But we want to make it clear that our suspicion comes from their actions and their ideology. When I'm talking about the Talmud here, you notice that I always say Orthodox Judaism, which is really the only Judaism. The other forms of Judaism, such as Reform, Reconstructionist, and the misnamed Conservative, do not really hold the Talmud in pride of place. But they are all allied on the racial nationalist Zionist issue. So they are Talmudic in the sense that the vast majority of them are at least for the existence of the Israeli state, in other words, for the theft of Palestinian land, for the creation of an apartheid state. I'm not for a two-state solution, I'm for one state, just like in South Africa. The blacks and the whites are living together. Palestinians and Judaic people should live together in one state. So they're virtually 90%, 95% pro-Zionist, even when they don't have the Talmud. Because as I mentioned at the outset with Greenspan, there's enough of this cerebral nostalgia for their ethnicity, and they associate the Talmud as the guardian of that ethnicity. But I do want to make it clear that the majority Judaism in the United States is Reform Judaism. Orthodox Judaism is catching up because of their high birth rate, but they're still behind the Reform. And the typical Reform Judaic has maybe never seen the Talmud. So then, therefore, the corollary would be, does that mean they're benign? No, because they subscribe to a Talmudic ideology, which is Zionism. And that's how they're Talmudized.
Yeah, Michael, I was wondering if you'd comment on the hate crime laws. Where are they going? Your timeline. Is it possible that they could ever make them retroactive so that everybody sitting in this room would be persecuted?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think some of it is a red herring to distract us. I am deeply concerned about hate crime law. I thought it was much more of a threat under Louis Freeh and Bill Clinton, because remember that the stage one of the process that they were trying to lock us down into, the Soviet tyranny digitally enhanced, which is always the goal, was Oklahoma City. And there the front man were the neo-Nazi patsies and nutcases that they used to do that. And then hate crime legislation was the use of the left and the liberals, canalize them, energize them, and to create a hate law. And you were seeing speech codes at various universities. Well, it didn't work. I mean, what happened was a lot of us exposed the fact that these neo-Nazi groups that were involved were actually part of the intelligence apparatus. And as part of this revelation of the method, which involves freeze the facts at the time of the crime and then thaw them later out. Now that McVeigh is dead and the convictions are in place, we find out that the FBI and others are admitting that there were other perpetrators. So they didn't quite pull that off. But I think that's more part of when the liberals are in power and the left is in power. As part of this, I mean, left and right are products of the 1789 seating arrangement of the French National Assembly. I'm not right-wing or left. The Old Testament, I can see some significant left-wing aspects to it in its concern for justice for the poor and the widows, and I can see right-wing things in the New Testament. So I don't play that game. But now, since 9/11, they've had to energize the right wing, the patriot base. And they put in a right-wing president as opposed to a left-wing. And it's been his assignment, he's done a very good job, to Sovietize America from the aftermath of the 9/11, which of course, as most of you know, was a government crime rather than 12 Arab patsies with their box cutters. And so, for me, the real concern about hate crimes is this: that hate crime law will rattle along in the background. The Teddy Kennedys of the world will always be harping on it and so forth. It's very difficult to do that now for the same reason that they couldn't pass this immigration amnesty bill. Because in order for these talk show hosts, who have tremendous cachet in America today, to serve their prime function, which is to buttress the Israeli state, in order to maintain their credentials, they have to appear populist. So they will back genuinely populist issues. One of them was the anti-immigration movement. Now, it'd be very difficult for Hannity and the rest of the crowd. I don't even know their names. I never listen to them. I've got a weak stomach and I could throw up easily. But Hannity and the rest of the crowd would have a hard time getting a hate crime law past their people. When the left-wing base was much larger under Bill Clinton, they gave it a try. And as we go from this worst president to the next worst one, if Hillary gets in, they may reactivate that left paradigm. But what I'm concerned always is not symptoms, but roots. And the root is the Noahide laws, public law, which Ronald Reagan was among the first. Jimmy Carter was the first to invite the Chabad Lubavitch rabbis into the White House. Their holy book is called Tanya because each sect within Judaism has its own prophets and sages and so forth that are unique to the sect. And Tanya says that the Gentiles, the question is asked of Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Laeti, Rabbi, why are there so many Gentiles and so few Judaics? And he said, because of the same reason why there's so much trash. See, Gentiles are trash, and the world proliferates with trash. I mean, the world is full of trash. That's why the world is full of Gentiles. And of course, those of us who know the book of Genesis understand how scripturally nullifying that is, because God said to Abraham, your descendants will be as numerous as stars. Here's the rabbi contradicting that. But the Chabad Lubavitch, who are the most politically oriented, not necessarily the most powerful, but the most politically oriented and sort of weaponized, they've kind of weaponized the Talmud, to borrow a phrase from one of yesterday's speakers. We had a 9/11 conference here, and the professor used that phrase. I think I'll use it as well. They've weaponized the Talmud and politicized it. So there they are in the White House. And they've made their Grand Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who they believe to be the Messiah. He's deceased, but they still continue to believe he'll rise from the dead. They've made his birthday Education Day USA. And as part of that, they promulgated public law, which says Congress supports the institution of the Noahide laws. And they mention Chabad Lubavitch rabbi. Now the problem with that is, if these were the laws of Noah, the biblical Noah, that's fine. The rabbis hate Noah. They say he was a drunk. They make fun of him. They say he ran a vineyard. And then they have all that midrashic nonsense about his son sodomizing him on board Noah's Ark. And that's how we have the racial animus for black people as subhumans. The Bible doesn't say that Canaan or Ham, what race they were. The rabbis said they were black. They don't care about Noah. Their Noahide laws are the Talmudic Noahide laws, different from the Bible. That's where we're going to have these hate crime things come through. And it's going to be very, very effective because people are going to think it's biblically based. And what's so very dangerous about that is that one of the Noahide laws has capital punishment for the worship of idols. And if we were running a class here, and you could come back tomorrow and I could do part 2 of the slideshow, but all of this will be in my book, and I could show you again the passages from the Talmud and from the Halakha that say that the worship of Jesus Christ is idolatry. So there you have the basis for our execution. Now, this isn't very likely to happen in the current stage of processing, because right now there's tremendous lip service given to God and Jesus and Christianity, and George Bush is a Christian and all of that. So you've got to watch that out here in the corner. But they can certainly move it in fast. 9/11 was moved in very fast. It looked like we were under the rule of a bucolic half-wit. There's a village in Texas missing an idiot. That's what it looked like we had for president. And it looked like we were going to drift along with a mediocre conservative and not much was going to happen. I said, thank God, after Clinton, after that roller coaster ride. And this guy turned out to be a bigger demon. And so they are certainly capable of using this alchemical processing, this revelation of the method, and these very sophisticated mind control tactics. And that's why that law is sitting there in abeyance. Brian?
Yes, earlier in your talk you spoke about Spinoza being kicked out of the synagogue in Amsterdam. And you mentioned that Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel. I wanted to ask you if you were also aware that that same rabbi, 8 or 9 years before that, it was the man who sent the money to Oliver Cromwell to have King Charles I killed.
Yeah. Well,
it's in that book, The Nameless War.
The first one that I've been able to trace that brought Judaics in since King Edward I had banned them by parliamentary law, Queen Elizabeth I. That's what Christopher Marlowe wrote his play about, The Jew of Malta and Tamburlaine. It was a way, we hear so much about Shakespeare and Marlowe gets eclipsed. Marlowe might have been the greater of the two. It was a way to signal to the English people that Judaics were in London, because her personal physician, or at least that's what he was called, I wonder if he actually wasn't an intelligence agent, was a Portuguese Sephardic, Rodrigo. And he brought with him a whole entourage of, 50, 100, 150, historians disagree. And she actually had to have Rodrigo killed because there was so much alertness and awareness raised by Marlowe's play. You see, by virtue of him, he couldn't mention her by name, but he used symbols and imagery, and the English people were very astute back then. They got tipped off to it. But she did not eject all of them. So there actually was a crypto-Judaic community in Great Britain, and in the end, Oliver Cromwell simply said, the regime, actually, he was dying, simply said the Judaics are already here. And what's interesting is Charles I's son, Charles II, again, a putative Catholic or proto-Catholic or crypto-Catholic, permitted the readmission of the Judaics and continued to allow a body of law to be built up around them. So this notion that Cromwell bad, the Stuart kings good, I don't see it. But you are right insofar as Manasseh ben Israel definitely was a supporter of Cromwell, in the same way that the Judaics in 1938 chose Winston Churchill to be their candidate for prime minister. So really it was a movement of one. It was Oliver Cromwell and the tiny entourage around him. I could never indict the Puritans as